This conference is taking place at a critical juncture for Sri Lanka's economy. It is the midpoint of the reform program that Sri Lanka is going through. And it's also an important point because it is a moment where there are very big changes taking place on the global stage. So we're seeing increasing tariffs and a rapidly changing global economic order that is surrounded by profound uncertainty because we still have no idea how all of this will end. So I think it's fair to say that for all countries in the world, including Sri Lanka, the big challenge is how do you build resilience to this diverse set of external shocks that countries face in the current environment. Sri Lanka's experience really stands out. Just 2 years ago, it was going through a very severe crisis. And also, the progress that has been achieved is truly remarkable over a very short period of time. And you can take this from the IMF. I mean, we have 191 member countries. We pay very close attention to economic policies of all of our members. And it is very substantial, the progress that has been achieved in Sri Lanka over a very short period of time, and nobody should take that for granted. The crisis that came about 3 years ago was long in the making. It was precipitated by many years of tax revenue declining, increases in public debt, foreign exchange reserves that continue to deplete, and ultimately we saw one of the most severe crises that Sri Lanka has experienced. We had long lines for fuel, severe shortages of basic goods, record high inflation, widespread power outages. I mean, basically, daily existence had become a real hardship for people in Sri Lanka. Now, today, thanks to very difficult reforms, bold, courageous, difficult reforms, and also very important, which I want to recognize this, the commitment and the endurance of the people of Sri Lanka. Substantial progress has been made to bring back macroeconomic stability and reduce the hardships that people have faced. Not obviously, all of that has not gone away, but there has been progress made in reducing those hardships. Inflation has been brought down from levels of 70% 2 years ago to very, very low rates numbers at this point. On the fiscal front, there has been a remarkable turnaround, extraordinary adjustment, and tax revenues that have fallen quite substantially have recovered by more than 2/3. There were big milestones that were achieved, and I want to recognize some. Central bank independence is a big milestone. Improving public financial management, and strengthening the legal framework of anti-corruption. All of this is not just building institutions for its own sake, but it also delivers a lot of economic return to the country. Our own analysis shows that if a comprehensive governance reform is undertaken in Sri Lanka, it can increase GDP by more than 7% over the next decade and reduce the debt to GDP by more than 6 percentage points. So these are very substantial gains that come from good governance. Sri Lanka also took a very difficult decision. It was a much needed decision, but it was a difficult decision to restructure its debt. And I think this is another important thing to recognize, because if Sri Lanka had not done that, the adjustment that people of Sri Lanka would have had to bear would have been even greater. External creditors have forgiven about $3 billion in debt. Another $25 billion in debt has been restructured, and we've extended repayment over 2 decades and at lower interest rates. And now Sri Lanka's bonds are once again included in global indices, and its credit rating has improved. So I want to say this here, which is that the experience of Sri Lanka has actually provided very important lessons for the world. And lastly,
master the corporate world. Join IIT. Register now.
Whenever you do a debt restructuring, and especially if it involves domestic debt, which is something that was recognized very early on, that external debt restructuring would not be enough. Domestic debt would also need to be restructured. It had to be done very carefully to make sure that you didn't damage financial stability and social stability. So this was done with a lot of attention to detail, recognizing that there was a significant exposure of the domestic financial sector to these sovereign bonds. Central bank had exposure to the sovereign bonds, the pensions had exposure to sovereign bonds, to do this in a way that you didn't end up with damaging the financial sector. And again, now we have a banking sector that is functioning well, and we're seeing credit growing. So again, this is something that could not have been taken for granted, but actually played out very well. So this experience of Sri Lanka, I think you should take this as one of your accomplishments, is that because of the experience of Sri Lanka, we feel that future countries that come for debt restructuring will have an easier experience than what Sri Lanka went through, which was a really complex process. So again, on the global debt restructuring space, I think Sri Lanka's experience will be an important chapter for all of us to read and understand and to learn from, because this is going to help any future country that needs restructuring coming ahead. At the IMF, we will continue to work with the World Bank, the G20 presidency who takes part in the common framework, the Paris Club, everybody to make sure that this restructuring takes place on a timely basis and is done effectively. Now, what about the lesson? What is the lesson for Sri Lanka of the debt restructuring? I think the lesson is that it should never have to go through this again. I think that this is the lesson to be taken away, which is that Sri Lanka should never find itself in a similar situation where it needs to go through restructuring. I want to recognize that the achievements that have taken place over the last 2 years would not have been possible without the courage and sacrifice of the people of Sri Lanka. We all recognize this. The crisis was costly, it was painful, especially for the most vulnerable in society. And the reforms that were undertaken to address the root causes of the crisis. As the president said, it is a deep wound. It's not going to be healed overnight. But addressing those root causes, and among those root causes were, removing unsustainable subsidies. So when we have this cost-reflective energy pricing, it is trying to fix a problem that otherwise would give rise to a crisis again in the future. Tackling corruption will be critical here, and here the government's action plan, which is firstly, we should recognize that was a very important step that was done. The governance diagnostics that was done for Sri Lanka was the first of its kind done in Asia. That is a big step that was taken. And the action plan is also very important to make sure that the right reforms are undertaken. Sound fiscal policy, as boring as that sounds, is going to be very critical to make sure that Sri Lanka doesn't return to a crisis. Because we are in an environment, as I said, which is challenging with tariffs, the developments in the Middle East, what may happen to energy prices, lots of uncertainty around it. So there's really no room for policy errors. Sri Lanka has delivered. We're at this midpoint where we are in a good place. The reforms look strong. Progress looks strong. But we also have to remind ourselves of the risks. So the IMF has had, with Sri Lanka, we've had 16 previous programs. About half of them have ended prematurely. And the reason that has happened is because reform fatigue sets in, the hard-won gains get reversed. And so I think we can all agree that the country cannot afford to repeat this cycle. It is critically important to sustain the reform momentum and to do so in a manner that's inclusive and accountable. The IMF will remain a steadfast partner of Sri Lanka, and we very much look forward to working together to improve the lives of all the citizens now and future generations. I think, again, just to conclude, this time must be different. Like I said, we have 16 programs before. This is the 17th program for. This time must be different. As the president just said, let us ensure that this is the last IMF program Sri Lanka will have. We completely agree with that. We believe that is possible as long as Sri Lanka stays the course.